Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Please welcome again Dr. Andrew Rabin.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to see all of you here again for a discussion tonight of alchemy, alchemists, and the hunt for the Philosopher's Stone, or, as I promised last week, potions. That's a face that's going to haunt your dreams. So what is alchemy? The so-called mysterious science, this pursuit of knowledge that will enable somebody to manipulate the fabric of creation, perhaps for wealth, perhaps for power. And where did this study come from? Well, you could ask a lot of people, but we're going to start off by asking the great 12th century English historian, William of Malmesbury. William had no doubt whose fault it was that the Western world was plagued by alchemy. The fault lay with a French cleric with the unfortunate name of Gerbert. Gerbert d'Aurillac. Gerbert was power-hungry, according to William. Gerbert sought knowledge. Gerbert sought to change his place in the world. Gerbert turned his back on Christian learning and headed to Muslim Spain, where he apprenticed himself with a Spanish scientist or chemist or doctor or philosopher, depending on how this tale is told. And there he learned all of the secrets of Muslim science. But after a year or two, he learned that his master had a book secreted away. He asked his master about this book, but the master said, no, that learning isn't for you. Well, Gerbert, he did not take no for an answer. So seizing his opportunity, he stole the book and headed back to Europe, using the magic he found therein to keep his master from finding him, and then to achieve power and to go on to his second career as, there he is with the master. Sorry, I skipped a slide. Pope Sylvester II. William did not like Pope Sylvester II. Pope Sylvester was actually quite a guy. He was the first French pope. He was a tremendous humanist. He was a great reader of Latin poetry. He was fascinated by the natural world. He was somebody who was really interested in experimental science. It's actually to Pope Sylvester, or, Gerbert, that the weight system that makes most clocks work, or at least, before the electronic age made most clocks work. Supposedly he invented it. But the fact that William transformed Gerbert into this sort of evil magician figure, it actually tells us a lot about the way in which people perceived alchemy and alchemical science. Alchemy was something that was secret. It was something that came from mysterious books. Alchemy was something that originated in the Muslim world and traveled into the Christian world like an infection. It was a learning that was dangerous. It was a learning that would take you away from proper faith and proper belief in the church. These are actually themes that we're going to come back to repeatedly tonight. They are not, it hardly needs to be said, an accurate representation of either alchemy or Islamic science. Alchemy has been a constant presence within the scientific history of Western Europe and Western culture. It's been practiced by, among other people, the great scientist Paracelsus, the astrologer and, again, Scholar John Dee, Nicholas Flamel, who supposedly used it to live forever. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We'll come back to him later. Robert Boyle, the father of chemistry. Albertus Magnus, a saint. August Strindberg, the playwright. And of course, most famously, Sir Isaac Newton, who was a dedicated and fascinated alchemist. Alchemy also lives within our popular culture. Chaucer included an alchemist as the canon in the Canterbury Tales. There's the famous play by Ben Jonson. Not to mention Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Or, if you prefer not to stick in that sort of corner of the literary imagination, it also lives on in the form of New Age science, New Age medicine, most famously through the works of Paulo Coelho. But what actually is alchemy? If we're going to say that it is not some sort of devilish pursuit, even though it's frequently portrayed that way, what was alchemy in reality? Well, we can get a sense of what alchemy was if we do a little linguistic work. The word alchemy comes from the Greek chemia, which literally means the transmutation of metals. It then moves on into Arabic, where it becomes alchemia. Again, the transmutation of metals, or, as that word comes down to us, chemistry. Now, here's the thing. That all there, right in front of it, that's just an Arabic, not the indirect object. Sorry, I'm blanking on my grammatical terms tonight. It's essentially a the. And so when it comes to Western Europe, in the form of the word alchemy, really what's happening there, and this is something we're going to see quite a bit, again, over the next hour or so, all that happens is that an Arabic word is used to designate something mysterious. How do we know something's a little dangerous? How do we know that something's a little off the appropriate path of knowledge and learning? Well, it has an Arabic name. It has a foreign name that doesn't have a clear grounding in either Latin or good, solid vernacular languages like English. But if we really want to understand what alchemy is, based on that etymology, really what alchemy is the combination of metallurgy, chemistry, and medicine. And if we want to think about the impact of alchemy on the development of Western science and the development of Western knowledge, really, it's actually in these three areas that alchemy has had its greatest impact. Now, if you were an alchemist in the Middle Ages, really what you were doing was practicing what we would recognize as a scientific endeavor. That is, if we clear away all of the different sort of mumbo-jumbo associated with it, alchemists had a basic theory of matter. Alchemists had a basic set of procedures. Alchemists had a basic set of principles that they followed in the form of experiments that were ideally falsifiable. That is, not just to be performed once, but then to be reperformed to confirm their accuracy. So what were the principles of alchemy? What would you believe, or what would you use as your guiding lights if you were practicing alchemy in the Middle Ages? Well, first of all, you would say everything is made up of a combination of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These elements have certain specific characteristics. So fire is hot and dry, earth is cool and dry, air is hot and moist, water is cool and moist. These elements combine to produce, well, virtually all physical matter. So not necessarily organic matter, though it is used that way too at times, but certainly physical matter. Now, the basis for our understanding of physical matter, and especially metals, is what was called the mercury-sulfur theory of metals. That is the belief that all metals are basically made up of some combination of sulfur or mercury, so that every metal has certain properties. These properties reflect those of the elements. So it might be hot and dry, it might be cool and moist. In this case, sulfur, hot and dry, mercury, cool and moist. Every metal is, to some degree, made up of some kind of ratio of those two, with the perfect ratio being gold. But the real goal of alchemy was not necessarily the pursuit of just the metal gold. You were actually pursuing something much more important. Alchemy is very much about the pursuit of perfection. Any metal that exists as it exists in the world is, at least as it was believed by the alchemists, cursed with impurities. Even gold, I mean, if we want to think about gold, right, we can't really even use gold unless it's alloyed with another metal. The goal of the alchemist was to get to the pure state of a metal, or get to the pure state of a substance by removing all of those impurities and really understanding what is the balance of sulfur and mercury that makes that metal itself. And ideally, how can that balance of sulfur and mercury be changed to allow that metal to interact properly with other metals, to be transmuted into other metals, that is, to be used to make different alloys, well, maybe alloys that are stronger metals, or alloys that are more useful for certain kinds of industrial procedures. And ultimately, of course, also to find a way to get to that purest of metals, to get to gold. The alchemical process went through 4 stages that were associated with colors. So essentially, you would start with what was called your prima materia, that is, your original material. And gradually, through a series of processes, heating, cooling, purification, filtration, many of which were in fact invented by medieval alchemists and are still used today in industrial processes, you first take your substance to the state of nigredo, that is the state of blackness. And your goal is to take that nigredo through a series of, you might say, phase changes to whiteness, to yellowness, citrinitas, and finally to rubedo, to redness. And when you've taken your metal all the way to redness, you have gotten to the most important substance of all, the Philosopher's Stone. What is the Philosopher's Stone? Well, the first thing you need to do is sort of put out of your head everything you learned about the Philosopher's Stone from Harry Potter. The Philosopher's Stone is actually a really pretty amazing substance. You might say that the Philosopher's Stone is the key to the functioning of nature. The Philosopher's Stone is that pure substance that will allow you to manipulate metals, to manipulate nature, but also to achieve your highest goal, which, for most alchemists, wasn't gold. Gold does not necessarily solve all your problems. You know what's a whole lot more useful? A medicine that would cure all ills. According to one alchemical text, the stone indeed is a wonder because it makes the old young and the dead alive. Learn this, for this stone is administered at the time of the death rattle in an amount equal to a grain of wheat soaked in wine so that it passes through the throat. It revives him, our suffering patient, and carried to the heart, it heats and immediately expels and destroys the evil humors, removes the poison, and gives life to the natural heat up to the liver. And if an old man uses this in a small amount and adds water of gold, it takes away all the illnesses of old age, so that they will possess young men's hearts and bodies. And so this stone is called the elixir of life. And when we want to think about what medieval alchemists were really interested in, they were interested in creating gold. They were interested in finding new metals. But ultimately, the real goal is this elixir of life, finding that substance that is so pure that it can remove impurities in anything that it is mixed with or anything that it interacts with. And the ultimate impurity in the human experience is the infection, the illness, that which takes the body that was created by God and corrupts it. Ideally, the goal of the Philosopher's Stone is to reverse that corruption, to take the human body back to a state of perfection. But this is dangerous. This is not knowledge that everyone should have. In fact, to take a look at a different alchemical text, the so-called De Secretis Naturae, on the secrets of nature. But fools have not well understood the sayings of philosophers who were speaking obscurely, and surely the philosophers have done well to speak obscurely, because if they had expressed it clearly, they would have acted evilly for many reasons. First, because then all would have known the secret of the Philosopher's Stone. And secondly, because then the world would have been destroyed. Alchemy is secret knowledge. You may be aiming for the ultimate public good, whether that's in the form of wealth for your country or wealth for your patron, or in the form of medicine. But alchemy, you're dealing with the stuff of creation. You are putting yourself, in some sense, in the place of a god. And so it must be approached with humility. It must be approached with learning. It's not something that somebody can just dabble in. And so medieval alchemists are very, very careful to keep what they're doing secret. They develop a series of symbols that they associate with different substances. This rather looks like a modern table of the elements. It isn't, and it actually wouldn't have been laid out like this in medieval text. It's just sort of a nice visual here. But we have here symbols, but they're associated with, well, we have iron, cobalt, nickel, copper, but we also have glass, and we have clay, wood, all of the different basic materials that you might use in your hunt for the Philosopher's Stone. You'll also have your 4 elements and the various signs of the zodiac. There we go. Signs of the zodiac, as well as other astral bodies. Anything that might influence the development of your Philosopher's Stone, if you can get there. They also develop what we might think of as their own professional language. The language of an alchemical text is littered with what scholars have called deknomen, literally cover names. That is, names designed to hide the actual material that the alchemist is working with. So, for instance, you have Sol, the sun, which is gold, Luna, the moon, silver. A woman pregnant with a girl refers to the albedo stage. Venus is copper. The 6 nations, the 6 planets. Saturn is lead. The salamander, the blood of the green lion, that's the prima materia. That's your starting stuff. There's sulfur is the father. Mars, iron. The king of the 6 nations, the sun, or gold. Jupiter is tin. 4 spirits, arsenic, sulfur, mercury, and sol ammoniac. And of course, the chemical wedding. That is the joining of male and female elements. That is fire and air, or water and earth. And you could go on and on and on. And these are deeply, deeply confusing. I can say, as somebody who has edited alchemical texts, they really make you feel fairly homicidal. And to give you a sense, I'll just give you some of the deknomen for Mercury. Mercury is argent vive, Azok. Azok is a great name for Mercury. Sounds like a strange pagan god. Anybody want to guess the origin of Azok? It's the Arabic word for Mercury. Again, just taking a foreign name and using that to create the feeling of mystery. blood, dragon, fiery water, fugitive, milk, the pure mother, quicksilver, she-dog, or another word, slave, soul, and water. And that's just a small list of them. When you are reading through an alchemical manual and you start running across these terms, the goal is, at least as the alchemist claims, to be transmitting secret knowledge to other alchemists. But the goal is just as much to ensure that you, the unschooled, unlearned reader, can't somehow penetrate the mysteries of this process. Now, if you were to ask a medieval alchemist, where does your science originate? He would have an easy answer for you, or a quick answer for you. It originated with the great classical scientist Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes the thrice great. Hermes Trismegistus is a shadowy mythological figure. We don't know much about him. From a modern perspective, he's very clearly a combination of the Greek or the Egyptian god Thoth, the god of wisdom, and the Greek god Hermes, or Roman in this case, Mercury. And the figure, the myth of Hermes Trismegistus takes from both of these figures. Hermes Trismegistus records his observations, records his discoveries in the form of mysterious symbols, hieroglyphics. If you were actually to ask an ancient Egyptian, the hieroglyphics that are associated with Hermes Trismegistus, nothing to do with hieroglyphics, but they're sort of mysterious squiggles, so clearly they're hieroglyphics. And of course, he uses Mercury. Supposedly, all of the mysteries of alchemy are contained in a single text composed by Hermes Trismegistus, the so-called Emerald Tablet. Now, if you remember from last class, during the question and answer period, I told a little story about the Grail and how one of the inspirations for the literary Grail was what was thought to be an emerald cup that was carried back to Western Europe during the Crusades. Of course, it was only green glass. But here we have another instance of supposedly emerald being a means of preserving or transmitting something magical, a certain kind of magical knowledge. The text of the Emerald Tablet does survive for us, though if you were to spend some time reading it, it's not actually all that helpful. It sets out a series of points, and this is just the beginning. True it is, without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that below is like to that which is above. Thanks for clearing that up. To accomplish the miracles of one thing, and as all things were by a certain contemplation of one, so all things arose from this one thing by a single act of adaptation. Right? And here we have the idea, this is what creation is here. You have the founding, the creative impulse of God, but all subsequent creation, adaptation, and mixture. The father thereof is the sun, and the mother the moon. The wind carried it in its womb. The earth is the nurse thereof. It is the father of all works of wonder throughout the world. The power thereof is perfect. Medieval alchemists would spend hours poring over the text of the Emerald Tablet, trying to figure out what actually did Hermes Trismegistus mean. In fact, the Emerald Tablet does not come from some, or at least from a medieval perspective, some ancient mysterious past. It actually emerges, or the text of it emerges, there is no surviving tablet, but the text of it emerges in the Muslim world in roughly the 8th, early 9th centuries. So even this text, it emerges essentially as a mythological origin myth, or a mythological origin story for the study of alchemy. But nonetheless, Hermes Trismegistus becomes the ideal figure of the alchemist, and he gives rise to a series of other mythological figures. So, for instance, we have Ostanes, Agathodaimon, who is apparently a snake of some sort, and my personal favorite, Moses the Thrice Happy. He clearly lived a really good life, except none of these people actually existed. However, according to the myth of alchemy, these are, you might say, some of the founding fathers of our science. Okay, now we have a second origin for alchemy. We had William of Malmesbury's story of Gerbert. Now we have the story of Hermes Trismegistus and his followers. Can we actually get at a real origin story for alchemy? Actually, we can. Where does alchemy actually originate? Well, in a somewhat less exciting way, it originates with the works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, so people like Thales, and the emergence of the idea of the atomic theory of matter. That is, that matter is made up of certain irreducible elements that combine together to produce the material world. This is an idea that was sort of originated with Heraclitus, who actually here is portrayed. This is, of course, the School of Athens. All of the different figures here are philosophers, but they are portraits of different Renaissance painters. So Leonardo da Vinci is Plato, and Michelangelo down here, Heraclitus. This idea that the whole universe is made up of these irreducible elements that can be combined and recombined, that is the core of alchemy. The first real historical alchemist who's doing something that we would recognize as alchemy is a fellow by the name of Zosimus of Panopolis, who lived sometime during the 4th century CE. We don't have any complete works of Zosimus. We only have various fragments of the text that survive, but he does seem to have been an actual historical figure. That actually is supposed to be a portrait of him. And Zosimus claims to have inherited or been inspired by the work of other alchemists before him, people who may have been historical and may not. We're not really sure. But you have someone named Marie the Jewess, who is actually sort of important in the history of science, and that's why I have this little picture here. Supposedly, Marie the Jewess invented something called the bain-marie, or as we now know it, the double boiler. There's Cleopatra the alchemist, and Paphnuntia the virgin. We don't know how she felt about that. But these figures provide the early grounding for what's going to become medieval alchemy. Now, this knowledge does not survive in the West with the fall of the Roman Empire. Like so much other knowledge developed in the classical world, once the empire falls, it survives only in the East, first in the Byzantine Empire, and then gradually in the Islamic world. And the most sort of important figures as alchemy sort of emerges as a form of science in the Islamic world are people with names like, well, the famous Avicenna, Abu Bakr al-Razi, and Jabir ibn Hayyan. Now, here's the thing about these three fellows and their contemporaries. We call them alchemists, practicing some sort of mysterious science. They actually didn't necessarily see themselves that way. Avicenna is a physician. They are engaged in scientific work. Their work is not necessarily secretive or designed to be secretive. This is not yet forbidden knowledge. In their work, though, we see the emergence of a number of foundational principles in modern scientific and medical practice. So, for instance, it's by them that we see the development of many of the tools and glassware that you use in a modern laboratory. So alembics, the glass jar that has a round bulbous bottom and a skinny top, thermometers, in medicine, the forceps, the scalpel. They develop methodologies like crystallization, calcination, filtration, and oxidation. They are the first to purify certain substances. So here we have the origin of sulfuric, hydrochloric, and nitric acids. They're the first to distill pure alcohol, ammonia, arsenic. Agatha Christie's very grateful for that one, and potassium chloride. It's with Avicenna and his contemporaries that the idea of pharmacology as a distinct area of knowledge for which people need to be specially trained in a formal institution, they're the ones who develop that idea. And perhaps most importantly, for modern scientific practice, they're the ones who really develop the idea of the scientific or experimental method. The idea that every experiment has to be carried out as objectively as possible and has to be repeatable in order for its conclusions to be considered in any way reliable. Now, over the course of, well, really the 11th and 12th centuries, the world of medieval Europe starts to expand as you see the development of more trade routes going east into the Islamic world and all the way east into China, of course, most famously with Marco Polo. And as you have traders from Europe coming this way and bringing back spices and new fabrics and all of the different new goods that they've discovered by going east, they're also bringing back with them the knowledge of the East. And this is the first condition necessary for medieval alchemy in Western Europe to develop. The traveling of this knowledge from the Mediterranean basin and further eastward up into Western Europe. And if we want to think about how this knowledge traveled and how this develops, we just have to look at the second important feature, or the second important element necessary for the development of medieval alchemy, and that is the rise of the city. The creation of an urban space dominated by trade rather than agriculture. People who are going to receive these books, who are going to be interested, like any good middle-class person is, into striving to achieve a higher social status, into giving their children a better education so they can achieve a higher social status. These are people who are going to be very receptive to these alchemical texts. Now, it's worth noting here, if we want to think about that map of goods going west, note here just the distribution of cities, or medieval cities in England. Notice how they are all in the southwest, or in the southeast of England, the place where that knowledge and those goods are going to arrive first. So now we have two conditions necessary for the emergence of medieval alchemy. First, we have the travel of knowledge west. Second, the rise of the cities. Third, the rise of universities. The rise, that is, of institutions dedicated specifically to forms of learning. So certainly, perhaps most famously, it's during this period that we see the emergence of Oxford and Cambridge as the premier English universities. It is during this period that we see the emergence of the University of Paris. Now, universities back then certainly didn't look much like universities today, though professors back then were still broke. But nonetheless, now you start having groups of people gathered together, focused on questions of not just knowledge and discovery, but the development of professional knowledge. There's one last important element necessary for the emergence of alchemy in the medieval West. And it's not one that people necessarily always think about, but it is crucial. And that is the life and work of St. Francis of Assisi. Why would St. Francis be so important in this process? Francis is known not just as sort of the poor saint, or the saint of the poor, the saint who embraced holy poverty and founded the order of Franciscans. He also is the saint of the natural world. Many alchemists were either Franciscans themselves or associated with the Franciscan movement, because this is a movement that is deeply interested in turning our attention to the natural world, understanding the natural world as not just something that's sort of, plopped out of nowhere, but God's greatest creation. a place where we can look to really find God's plan for humans and for the arc of the universe. Now, the Franciscans, when they sort of emerged as an early order of clerisy, were actually fairly controversial. They strongly believed in the poverty of the church, the idea that the Catholic Church would have these wealthy popes with gold and jewels and giant, beautiful churches. They saw that as antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. If the church is going to serve the poor, the church should not gather riches for itself. This obviously did not make them very popular with, well, the church hierarchy. There's a reason that it took until the 21st century for us to finally have a Franciscan pope. They were wanderers, right? They did not live within some sort of institutional structure. Franciscans weren't monks, they were friars. They traveled from town to town in poverty. So they're not necessarily as constrained or under as much supervision of an abbot or a priest or somebody that connected with the church hierarchy, which means, from an Orthodox perspective, Franciscans, there's the potential breeding ground for heresy there. These associations with the Franciscans, people as being a little bit too interested in nature, sort of remnants of paganism there, and people who traveled on their own and weren't necessarily, at least from an outsider's perspective, adhering to church discipline, and people who did not, again, from the institution's perspective, did not respect the institutional wealth and institutional power of the Holy Church. This idea of the Franciscans as being a little bit questionable, well, a lot of that gets linked to the emergence of alchemy and the kinds of reputations that alchemists had during this period. Now, the practice of alchemy in the High and Late Middle Ages, we tend to associate it as kind of a mystical, magical kind of endeavor, partially because it has sort of a mystical, magical kind of language. It's a concept of mystery that is cultivated by medieval alchemists. But it's important to remember that these are actually pretty hard-headed individuals. So in one text, actually that De Secretis Naturae, on the secrets of nature, you actually have some advice to the would-be alchemist, and it's really practical. Whoever should want to practice this science should have at hand disbursements or funding for at least 2 years, in order that, should he make a mistake for the first time, he may begin the work again. Moreover, you should by no means practice the science under the authority of any important person or prince, for many reasons. First, because if the work is of long duration, he will ask you daily, "Master, how's it going with the work?" And if he anticipates completion of the work, then he will say, "Master, I could wish that you would teach me." And if you say no, he will seize you. But if you say yes, well, when you have taught him, he will arrange to kill you so that no one will know besides him. What's the advice here? It's advice that any modern academic would recognize. Make sure you have funding. In order to get funding, lie to your funders. Tell them you're looking for gold. And then you can go back to trying to figure out new and innovative metal alloys, right? Science always needs some sort of lofty goal in order to do the kind of pedestrian work necessary for real discovery. And one way of looking at alchemy is as a practice that develops in part to allow that kind of scientific practice to function. Now, that's not to say that as you have these people in the universities working on this new science of alchemy, or you have people in the cities working on this new science of alchemy, that it was uncontroversial. In fact, in the 14th century, there's a papal bull issued opposed to alchemy called Spondent Quas. It calls alchemy the crime of falsification. It says that alchemists dissimulate their failure, so that finally, though there is no such thing in nature, they pretend to make genuine gold and silver by a sophistic transmutation. You remember last time we saw the association of magic with sophism. By a sophistic transmutation, to such an extent does their damned and damnable temerity go, that they stamp upon the base metal the characters of public money for believing eyes. And it is only in this way that they deceive the ignorant populace as to the alchemic fire of their furnace. Now, it's important to pay attention to the Pope's language here, to get a sense of what actually he's objecting to. Note that neither here nor, if we had the entire bull before us, anywhere else in the bull does he complain about experimentation. Neither here nor anywhere else does he complain about medical research or natural research. What is he really concerned with? Fraud and forgery. That really is the danger posed by alchemists to most of the institutional structures of the Middle Ages. Not the idea that people are engaged in this kind of experimentation, but the fear that they might be unreliable, they might be faking things, and thus in producing false gold and producing false money, they disrupt the economic systems and the political systems of Europe. So what did a medieval alchemist look like? Well, let's look at two of the most famous. Let's start with Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon was born roughly 1219. We're actually not entirely sure when he was born, and died sometime after 1292. Bacon was a scholar at Oxford and the University of Paris. Bacon was somebody who was fascinated with scientific texts. Indeed, Bacon is considered one of the early pioneers of experimental science. Bacon receives the works of Aristotle as they're filtering to the West and starts testing Aristotle's conclusions. And as he does so, he starts finding places where Aristotle was perfectly correct, but there are also a bunch of places where Aristotle is wrong. Now, in an intellectual world in which all knowledge rests on authority, Bacon wants to rest knowledge not on the fact that it comes from some hoary philosophical or religious authority, but on experimentation. Bacon has no trouble disagreeing with Aristotle, or, for that matter, disagreeing with any of the people around him. In fact, Bacon, brilliant as he was, comes across in his writings and other people speak about him as kind of an asshole. He did not have a whole lot of patience for people who disagreed with him or for people he thought were acting foolishly or wrongly. This would, over the course of his life, repeatedly get him into trouble. At one point, it seems, we're not entirely sure, but it seems that he may even have been imprisoned for being sort of an intellectual crank. Later on, this is going to turn into a myth that he was actually imprisoned as an alchemist. But really, it seems, sort of the early records suggest that if he was imprisoned at all, it was the fact that he basically spent a lot of his time insulting very powerful people. And indeed, one of the reasons that he kept going back and forth between Paris and Oxford is they couldn't stay in one place long enough before getting booted out. The only thing that happened to protect Roger was the fact that one of his fellow students at Oxford during his early days later went on to become Pope. So it's good to have friends in high places. What are some of Bacon's real scientific accomplishments? Well, calendrical reform. The Gregorian calendar isn't going to be instituted for another couple of hundred years, but the examination of the movement of the planets, the determination of the proper length or the real length of a year as roughly 365 and a quarter days, basically the sorts of discoveries necessary to move from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, they start with Roger Bacon. Bacon is fascinated by the anatomy of the eye. He provides some of the earliest illustrations of essentially an eye bisected so that you can see the relationship between different lenses and vitreous fluid. Bacon is also responsible, related to that, to optics becoming a formal area of study at the university. Bacon is, as far as we know, the earliest Western scientist to have worked with and described the use of gunpowder. Obviously, as we all know, that originated far to the east, but Bacon seems to have been the first Western scientist to actually really work on it. And these weren't the limits of Bacon's interest. Bacon also worked to try to discover a universal grammar at the foundation of all human languages. So he is a pioneer in the study of linguistics. Bacon is also a philosopher. Bacon is a theologian. Bacon is somebody whose, knowledge of the world was capacious. And part of that capaciousness was that Bacon was interested in alchemy. Though for Bacon, alchemy had a very, very specific meaning. Bacon was interested in what was called medicinal alchemy. That is, when we think about that idea of the Philosopher's Stone as being the perfect medicine, Bacon wasn't necessarily always that ambitious, but he was really interested in the way in which different substances, metals, chemicals, could be combined together to develop our knowledge of the natural world and to heal human illness. Now, after Bacon dies, the fact that he was this sort of problematic figure, somebody who was so smart that nobody really quite recognized the extent of his knowledge, the fact that he seemed to have access to sources of knowledge that nobody else had, and the fact that he didn't seem to trust traditional sources of knowledge, that contributed to the image of Bacon as a magician and magical alchemist. And of course, the most famous story associated with Bacon is the story of the brazen head. Brazen heads are actually a not uncommon feature in various myths associated with alchemy. The earliest version of one actually comes all the way back from William of Malmesbury in his account of Gerbert. But the story of Bacon's brazen head goes rather like this. Bacon, using his alchemical knowledge, sought to create a head that would speak and deliver him the knowledge of the future. To do this, to attain this knowledge, as any proper Faustian intellectual would do, he made a deal with the devil. And he was told that he had to work on this head through various magical and alchemical processes for weeks and weeks on end, and most importantly, that the bellows had to keep going to forge this head. He couldn't fall asleep, and he couldn't rest. Well, of course, Bacon needed some rest. And so, foolishly, he trusted his lab assistant, a fellow with the oddly modern name of Miles. Miles falls asleep. And what happens is that you result in a brazen head that can only say the quasi-mystical, quasi-nonsensical words, time is, time was, time is past. A wonderful allegory for a failure of humility in science, sort of a humorous takedown of an intellectual figure, right? And a sign that, if you try to make a deal with the devil, inevitably you will come to grief. Nonetheless, the story of the brazen head has permeated Western culture. We had the cartoon I just showed earlier. My personal favorite modern representation of the brazen head is the oldest pub in Ireland. You can visit it in Dublin. So that gives you one model of an alchemist's life. Let's take a look at another one. And here we'll take a look at one of the alchemists who is most famous in the modern world thanks to his association with popular culture, and that is Nicholas Flamel. Nicholas Flamel spent most of his life living in Paris. His house actually survives. You can go and visit it today, as does, by the way, his tombstone, so we're pretty sure that he did actually die. In fact, Nicholas Flamel wasn't a chemist or a scientist at all. He was a scribe, and apparently a very, very good scribe, because he and his wife became quite wealthy, and we know this in part because they were also quite charitable. There is no clear evidence, though, that Nicholas Flamel, despite being an intellectual, despite being somebody who clearly had found a lot of gold, in this case through hard work, not magic, but there's no evidence that he was actually ever an alchemist or interested in alchemy. So where did that come from? Well, to do that, we've got to take a look at the other Nicholas Flamel. For those of you lucky enough not to have seen the movie, that's the Nicholas Flamel from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Though you might prefer to think of him as one of the protagonists in the horror film, or the antagonist as Above, So Below, or one of the heroes of the Michael Scott Eternal Life of Nicholas Flamel books. So where did this particular myth of Nicholas Flamel come from? Well, it actually doesn't originate until about 200 years after his death, with the publication of a book called Nicholas Flamel's Exposition of the Hieroglyphical Figures, which he caused to be painted upon an arch in St. Innocent's Churchyard in Paris. This book is published in 1604, first English edition, 1614, and it proves to be tremendously popular. And in it, it tells the story of Nicholas Flamel, the alchemist. And the story goes rather like this. This is from the introduction to the book. There fell into my hands for the sum of 2 florins a gilded book, very old and large. So again, we have this idea of ancient knowledge that is preserved in a mysterious book. It was not of paper or parchment as other books, but it was made only of the delicate rinds of tender young trees. The cover of it was of brass, well bound, all engraved with letters or strange figures, and for my part, I think they might well be Greek or some such like ancient language. However, Nicholas Flamel, at least initially, claims, I don't actually know how to read this language. In fact, if you look at the signs that are replicated in the book, they're not Greek or any other ancient language. They are squiggles, but they're magical squiggles. Flamel goes on. Upon the first of its leaves was written in great capital letters of gold, Abraham the Jew prince, Abraham the Jew prince, priest, Levite, astrologer, and philosopher, to the nation of the Jews, by the wrath of God dispersed among the Gauls, sendeth health. After this, it was filled with great execrations and curses, including the word Maranatha, which comes from Corinthians. It is a biblical curse, the anathema, Maranatha, which are a collection of syllables that actually nobody really knows what they mean. So it's sort of the perfect kind of alchemical curse, which was often repeated there against every person that should cast his eyes upon it if he were not a sacrificer or a scribe. So not only is this ancient learning, it is ancient forbidden learning, and it comes from a foreign Eastern people, the Jews. He says that he that sold me this book knew not what it was worth, no more than I when I bought it. I believe it had been stolen or taken from the miserable Jews. So if we want to think all the way back to that William of Malmesbury story, again, we have the idea this knowledge wasn't just transmitted, this knowledge was stolen. I believe it to have been stolen, taken from the Jews, or found hid in some part of the ancient place of their abode, the apparently Jewish bat cave. Within the book, on the second leaf, he comforted his nation, counseling them to flee vices and, above all, idolatry, attending with sweet patience the coming of the Messiah. So, fortunately, this apparently happened to be a Christian Jew, prince, priest, Levite, astrologer, or at least one who, saw it coming. Importantly for Nicholas, he had a partner in his work. And if we want to think back to those early female alchemists, people like Mary, Cleopatra, and Paphnuntia, here we have Nicholas's wife. My wife Perenelle, whom I loved as myself and had lately married, was much astonished at this book, comforting me and earnestly demanding if she could by any means deliver me from this trouble, my anxiety about what I'm going to do with this book. I could not possibly hold my tongue, but told her all and showed her this fair book, whereof at the same instant she saw it, she became as much enamored as myself, taking extreme pleasure as myself. And if this story sounds familiar, take out the word book and put in the word apple. So the two of them pursue the knowledge that is found in this book. And eventually, having succeeded in discovering its secrets, he decides, I resolve to myself to be painted on the fourth arch of the churchyard of the Church of the Innocents in Paris as you enter the great gate in Saint-Denis Street, so good directions here, and taking away by the right hand the most true and essential marks of the art, yet under veils and hieroglyphical covertures, deknamen, secret signs, which may represent two things according to the capacity and understanding of them that behold them. First, the mysteries of our future and undoubted resurrection on the day of judgment, and secondly, all the principal and necessary operations of the mastery. And this supposedly is what that arch looked like. Unfortunately, we can't actually go back and check. The Church of the Holy Innocents was taken down in the year 1785, and the bones in its churchyard moved to the catacombs where you can still visit them today. They seem not to have taken any arches or hieroglyphics with them. And so this is the story of Nicholas Flamel. Again, somebody who has acquired secret, mysterious knowledge, has used that knowledge, but also hidden it from the world because it's dangerous knowledge, but has left traces or clues so that anybody else can discover it or recover it if they can. So how do we sum all of this up? How do we answer this question? Well, what is the importance of alchemy? On the one hand, there's the importance of alchemy as the foundation of many Western scientific practices and technologies. This is not a wholly magical practice. This is one grounded in experimental science. There's a reason that somebody like Isaac Newton or Robert Boyle was so attracted to it. But the alchemist also gives us another crucial figure, or another crucial idea in Western culture, and that is the idea of the mad scientist. The intellectual, driven mad by his desire for knowledge, who engages in secret, dangerous, obscure practices, all so that he can elevate himself to the denigration of others. Right? One of the most pernicious anti-intellectual myths to survive in Western culture. But it's one, of course, we see everywhere, perhaps most famously in the 1818 novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. If you read the novel, you'll find that the monster does not come to life because of a lightning bolt. Instead, Victor Frankenstein has spent he's not Von, he's just Victor Frankenstein. He only becomes Von when he goes to Hollywood. Victor Frankenstein is a college student who has lost his way. He's become bored with the kind of text that he's being taught in his classes, and so he starts to pursue secret texts, especially those by another famous alchemist by the name of Cornelius Agrippa. And there he finds the secret of the elixir of life. And so when he builds his human to be brought to life, it's actually a chemical process that he engages in, not one with mysterious machines and lightning. Victor Frankenstein, the mad scientist, is the perfect alchemist. But you have to stay on his good side, because if you call him Frankenstein, he will most assuredly remind you that his real name is Frankenstein. Thank you very much. And before I forget, next week, if you come back, we'll be moving on to our next Hogwarts class, spells, charms, and divination. In other words, witchcraft. Now, if anybody has any questions, go ahead. Yes?
So the story you told about Roger Bacon and Mouse, is that like the basis of the Disney Sorcerer's Apprentice?
Yep, that is one of the sources. That idea, yeah, that you have the apprentice who's curious but also incompetent. Though it's also, related to that sort of traditional idea of just the young person eager for greatness. It's one of these Joseph Campbell hero myths, right? Who goes out and has to fail before he can achieve greatness. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is also Luke Skywalker studying under Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yes?
Last week you talked about how the warnings of fraudulent or scammer magicians was really tied to or in service of, like, othering outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
When when the Pope was warning about fraudulent alchemists, was that also tied to sort of othering or xenophobia?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's deeply embedded in anti-Islamic sentiment and anti-Semitism, right? Part of the danger of alchemy is that it comes from non-Christian cultures. And so yeah, objections to alchemy are very much about objections to Jewish culture, objections to Islamic culture, and perceptions of the kinds of knowledge that they contain. If you think back to that Roman law that I put up last week, expelling the Chaldees and the Jews for their practices, that kind of knowledge, that's, at least in the mind of somebody opposed to alchemy in the Middle Ages, that's that knowledge, that's what they're doing. Other questions? Yes?
Did Nicholas Flamel get connected with the Philosopher's Stone? Is it that text, or?
It is that text. I don't know that anybody's really sure how Nicholas Flamel in particular became associated with it. It may simply have been nothing more than the fact that this is somebody who is associated with an area of learning as a scribe and notary, and somebody who, over the course of his life, apparently became quite wealthy. You know, he seemed to be somebody who had gold and had some sort of knowledge that got him there. And also, we're always suspicious of, you know, rich scholars. We still are today. I still am, at least.
What kind of legitimate medicines were actually used in this time?
So most of the medicines that are used during this period are not ones that we would necessarily, are not ones that we necessarily today would consider modern medicines, but certainly we have the use of various herbs as a means of alleviating symptoms. You have the use of various kinds of compresses, various kinds of mixtures of different liquids and chemicals. Perhaps the most famous one of these, at least associated with alchemy, is the use of mercury as a medicine, something that today we know really doesn't end well for anyone, but nonetheless was thought of as a substance that could be used for medicine. Other questions? Oh, sorry, yes?
Nicholas Flamel book in the 1600s that had
Not sure. Oh, sorry. Who wrote the Nicholas Flamel book if it wasn't Nicholas Flamel? Not entirely sure. It actually is published as part of a compilation. So we have the publisher and somebody who claims to be the editor, but the text itself, whether it originated there or originated somewhere else, it's unclear. Interestingly, the Flamel book is actually published alongside a classical alchemical text, or purports to be a classical alchemical text, by a mysterious classical alchemist, somebody who's otherwise, not attested anywhere. So in order for the Flamel myth to gain any sort of ground, it still had to be associated with that ancient tradition, or the myth of the ancient tradition of alchemy. Yeah?
I'm just curious what draws you to the subject. How did you get interested? Why have you spent hours and hours and probably a really long time reading ancient texts?
I am actually really glad you asked that question, because there's a story here. The question is, how did I start studying alchemy? And it wasn't because I wanted to find ways of turning substances into gold. I mean, not that that would be bad. But as some of you who have attended my lectures before know, my primary area is legal history. So what drew me to alchemy? Well, I was down at Vanderbilt looking at the papers of a woman named Dorothy Bethurum, who was one of the great mid-century Anglo-Saxonists. And I found in her papers a translation of an alchemical text. And this sort of blew me away, because I had no idea that Dorothy was in any way interested in alchemy. Well, in fact, as I read around, it turned out she wasn't. However, she was good friends with a scholar in the English department at Vanderbilt named Edgar Hill Duncan, and Edgar Hill Duncan was interested in alchemy. He was a late medieval literature scholar who focused on Chaucer, and his particular project, he had contracted with the publisher to produce an anthology of all of Chaucer's alchemical sources, because Chaucer was quite well read in alchemy. The problem with Edgar Duncan, brilliant as he was that he had no control over the project, over his papers. When I started digging into his papers, the guy was a hoarder. He kept every single slip of paper. My favorite moment was when I found a postcard to him written by my predecessor in the English department at the University of Louisville when he was a graduate student. The great Tom Van, if any of you ever had him. So I found in his papers all of these different references to alchemical texts, various manuscript images, and as I sort of traced his project, he started with it being roughly 300 pages. By the time he died, it was up to about 990 pages and nowhere near done. He had not gotten really, anywhere near publication. Which put me in sort of a really wonderful position. First of all, it meant that this was every medievalist's dream. I found all of these texts that had never been edited or published. But also, medieval studies is an area of study that still very much adheres to the idea of, you might say, the doctor father. That is, you are the descendant of your intellectual forebears. It's your job to carry on their work. One of my advisors told me when I left to take the job here at the University of Louisville, the first job of any Anglo-Saxonist is to ensure that they're not the last Anglo-Saxonist hired by their department. And so this also gave me the opportunity to honor Edgar Hill Duncan and his legacy by carrying out this project. And so I spent actually the last several years going through his manuscript images, re-editing these texts, which are now being published in a 3-volume set on Latin alchemical texts in the Middle Ages. The first volume actually just came out just before Christmas. It is wildly overpriced. And because of Trump's tariffs, not yet available in the United States. But it is the alchemical texts associated with a fellow named Arnold de Villanova, who was a medieval physician associated with the Franciscan movement. He checked most of the boxes that we talked about here. And these are alchemical texts that were attributed to him, including De Secretis Naturae, the one that I quoted from several times here. I should say that if any of you have the fantasy that actually studying alchemy is actually in any way fun, it really was like trying to read your high school chemistry textbook in Latin with code words. So I wrote these 3 books on it, and honestly, now I'm done. Yes. Sorry? They're being published in the series Dallas Medieval Texts and Translations, which is the publisher for it is the Belgian publisher Peters. You can find them if you go on their website, or at least find the first volume. It is, for a relatively thin paperback, a mere $80. I didn't pick the price. But if you're up for a really, really boring evening, revisiting your high school chemistry textbook in Latin with a translation, they are out there. Actually, though, from a scholarly perspective, it's actually quite valuable because it is a number of texts that have never been published. Well, I have to give the sales, but it's a number of texts that have never been published before that were used by people like Newton and Chaucer. And so to finally make these texts available to a scholarly audience is actually really exciting. But you know those old Andy Warhol movies that are 9 hours long of somebody sleeping? Kind of like that one. Any last questions? Well then, thank you all very much. I look forward to seeing you next week.